what I saw was that there was a lot of liberal leftist activity on the campus. People who were articulate, bright, and very dedicated and very hardworking on their political agenda. In fact, there were some, I can't name names or anything, but there was a sense that there were a lot of these students on there who were almost like paid activists. And I'm talking about the University of Michigan. I don't know about other schools. But it was partly in reaction, my reaction to that you'd go across campus and there'd be political booths all over the place for promoting, socialist causes and also civil rights, which we can discuss that later. But there were, I think conservatives might have been more involved in the civil rights movement had it not appeared to some of us at the outset that it was being manipulated and maneuvered by some hardcore liberal leftist activists. I found some place where there were people doing something. The Young Republicans at the University of Michigan were sort of a reflection of the National Party, in my view, then. Sort of the Me Too Republicans. Democrats outnumber us, we're never going to win, so we might as well sound like Democrats, just say we can do what they can do better. That was not appealing to me. And in the face of all this activism at the University of Michigan, I was saying, where are the organizations and the individuals who can, with passion and conviction, articulate a conservative, fundamental philosophy and carry this message? We would get into debates or shouting matches. There's an area at the University of Michigan, sort of a central area, where all the kids walk through the center of campus called the diagonal. And we would have tables set up there trying to recruit members into YAF, or College of Young Republicans. And we got very involved in student government council elections. We through our support behind a conservative. Again, this was very unusual because so much of the dominating activism was on the liberal to left side, and then the rest of people were sort of moderate. So for a conservative to come forward, I mean, they looked at us like we were, cyclops or something. But
I want to ask you a question about that subject too, a separate question. I remember at the time being laughed at. Specifically, remember that feeling quite well, actually, in 1963. Describe yourself how the conservatives were treated by the activist left and liberals, which
well, I can also tell you how they were treated by the academics, by the professors.
Tell me about that. The
Oh,
feeling of being a conservative. Because it's always spoken about, as you say, the activist left is always implying in the early 60s how hard it was.
Oh, baloney. I mean, I think a lot of that's baloney. Heck, they could close down Columbia University. They firebombed the University of Wisconsin laboratory, and the professors and the administrators sat on their hands. They did nothing. They were cowed by these kids, students. I mean, those weren't activists. Those were destroyers. My recollection, and I'm glad you asked me this. I can't remember the teacher's name, and it's lucky for him. But when I was a student at the University of Michigan, a freshman, I wanted to major in political science, and I had a student teacher who was working on his master's. As often you would have, you go to a lecture hall of 500 kids and then they break it up into recitation classes. Well, the recitation leader there, I remember very clearly, mocked me, laughed at me, really, in class. And I remember distinctly his talking about Marxist-Leninism, and talked about Marx in the context of basically he was the second coming of Christ. And I remember him saying that, if not literally. He said it's almost as if, this philosophy is going to do so much for the masses. I mean, it's like the second coming of Christ. And this astounded me. I wasn't hurt. I mean, how do you get hurt by something like that? I mean, I was involved in this, not that for people to love and accept me. I was involved in it because I believed in it. I learned a great deal. It stimulated me intellectually. It was an opportunity to work for things that I cared about, and I could see things, that would have an effect. So if somebody laughed at me, I didn't take any of that personally. What angered and alarmed me, those are my words. It angered and alarmed me to sit in a classroom at a university that has one of the finest liberal arts schools in the country, and to, in essence, listen to this propaganda. And I'm going to say one thing briefly. I remember very clearly Bill Buckley's line about describing the liberals' definition of academic freedom. And what he said I experienced in that classroom at the University of Michigan. He said the liberals' idea of academic freedom is to expose the student to everything from Galbraith to Schlesinger. And he's absolutely right. I asked the professor, why aren't we studying, or why aren't you talking about the works of Friedrich Hayek, who later won the Nobel Prize in Economics, Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, Ortega y Gasset, philosophers. Why are we talking all about Marxist Leninism as if this is the panacea for the problems of our age? You are not exposing us to these other thoughts. The idea of academic freedom, I did not experience that in a narrow sense in that classroom. Where I got exposure to a lot of these ideas and writers and thinkers was through my involvement in YAF. And because YAF was not only a political active organization, they were also very strong on the education side. You know where I had the greatest exposure to people that were different from my own background? And again, I grew up not thinking about my social, economic, or ethnic background. I mean, it's ridiculous. I thought of myself as an individual, part of a family, but we weren't stereotyping ourselves then as everybody seems compelled to do it now. But the way I met a lot of people from a wide range of backgrounds was through my political activism. In fact, I never really knew very many so-called blue-collar families. I came from a middle-class neighborhood of professionals and business people, some professors and so on. But it was not a community where there were a lot of people that, Joe Lunchpail went off to work at the factory or whatever. I came in contact with the sons and daughters of immigrants from Eastern Europe, from Latin America, Jews, very few blacks. Unfortunately, in Detroit, that's another area. That's one of the big failings of conservatives, and we can talk about that later. But that's where I really got to know people from a very different background. And their families, some of them weren't very well educated. Some didn't even have high school diplomas. But they had that common sense. They knew, they didn't get all tangled up in their thinking. It was sort of straight line thinking based on a lot of good old common sense and experience and looking at history. And their children reflected that. And the children were very, my peers were very active with us. So it was a melting pot.